everyone. My name is Hannah Davidson. I am currently the Director of Disability Services at St. Anselm College, which is a small private liberal arts college in New Hampshire. And I am just really happy to be connected to Nebby and sharing this little presentation with you about how to create accessible open educational resources and why it's important. Um, I think I'm going to hold off on doing much of a deeper introduction of myself and my work until the next slide. Because that's just an overview slide of the presentation. And one of the elements we'll be discussing will give me a chance to share a little bit more about how my work in disability services dovetails with my interest and my scholarly work in open education. So, without further ado, here's the overview slide of where we're going today. So we'll start with a little bit about why accessibility matters beyond the basic floor level legal compliance, and then we'll look at how accessibility and open education are connected. I'll explain a little bit about how that connection emerged for me professionally, and we'll sort of ground ourselves in the legal foundation so we understand kind of like the legal requirements behind why we do accessibility and why we create accessible digital materials, how the legal requirements are applied in the digital environment, and then we'll look at some current web accessibility guidelines, hopefully in a way that is practical and that will make you feel empowered, like you have enough of an understanding of the basic principles behind them without carrying too much worry about your own level of expertise in the area, because you have resources that provide that expertise on your behalf, and I'll be sure to point those out as well. And finally, we'll spend a little bit of time looking at the accessibility features that are specific to Pressbooks, since that's the platform that many people will be using. Okay, so the next slide start with students. If you have been to any sort of presentation or anything with me in the past, you'll know that I slide a slide in there that has something to do with student voice, student empowerment, and it's no different when we're talking about digital accessibility or open educational resources. I do this just as a reminder that students aren't just central to the day-to-day work we're doing, but also that they're the biggest, voice and agent of change institutionally. So, excuse me, since we're talking specifically about OER, I want to ask folks to think about how students actually are experiencing the course materials. So, for example, imagine that you have a student who is trying to do their homework, trying to complete a reading assignment that perhaps was created as a Word document or as a Canva sort of, one-page infographic sort of material, and they're using a screen reader, and the text might look organized visually to a sighted person, but if there aren't any headings, or if there is a lack of alt text, image descriptions to describe verbally anything that might be embedded, or if you have links that just say click here rather than describing what the link is actually clicking to access, that experience can be really different for someone who's relying on assistive technology to perceive these materials. So another example, maybe not related to someone with like a permanent visual impairment, but something more temporary or situational, like somebody might be recovering from a concussion and they're struggling to just comprehend dense material. Visual clutter maybe is a problem on the page. So that can be an access barrier. Or environmentally, we have a lot of students who are, living at home and working with a background of maybe younger siblings and in a noisy environment, and perhaps there is a video you've recorded, a lecture for students, but they are relying on closed captioning to be able to access it in a noisy environment. So if there is a lack of captioning, that can be a barrier. And I use these examples just to note that, yes, my day-to-day work is about accommodations for students with disabilities, but accessibility isn't about, a subset of the population or a specific group of people. It's really about how all students engage with their classes, with the content, with their materials every day. So when we, what is accessibility? That's such a huge topic. Obviously we can't talk about all of it in this short presentation, but I think I included it because it's important to have shared language when we're talking about new issues or emerging issues. So when we talk about accessibility, again, like, even though I work in a student-facing role that is centered on students who need accommodations to access their courses, often the level of access that's provided through those interactions are barriers that could be applicable to other students, barriers we could remove for all people, so that we're like really thinking about designing our materials in a way that are usable by as many people as we possibly can. And that absolutely, obviously, includes the students that I work with every day, but it also includes people with those temporary barriers, like an injury, like a concussion, situational barriers like having a cruddy internet connection. We live in rural New Hampshire and have recently switched to internet providers, but for a time it was, we were lucky if we got through a Zoom meeting without the wind blowing the wrong way and this is the connection going out. Or having a noisy setting, maybe, it's somebody who is accessing course materials on a break from their evening job, or, they have a family that is making noise behind them. And I think that when I talk about accessibility kind of largely writ, just broadly, my audience is most often teachers, either K to, like the K-12 teachers or college faculty more often, because that's where I am. When I'm introducing sort of the foundational concepts of accessibility, I like to remind people that a lot of what we do is just things that you're already doing as good teachers. So you're already providing clear structure. You're already providing adaptability and developmentally appropriate context and language, like in just the everyday teaching that you're doing. And all of that is part of accessibility and can generalize, like we kind of like generalize that application to digital content creation. And we can't go into like a deep dive into theoretical models of disability, but that's kind of where the barriers, not deficits heading comes from here. But we can't, like I said, go into that very deeply. So I'm gonna have to ask you to extend a little bit of trust that if we think about access issues as some kind of structural or systemic or technological barrier rather than a deficit that kind of lies within an individual person, then we'll naturally espouse practices that reach more people and are just generally more inclusive. So, that helps us to frame an issue about a student not being able to access something as not a problem with who they are or where they live or what kind of technology they have, but the issue as that the material might not have created with these barriers or reducing barriers in mind. So, for example, a classic example is using an old scanned PDF that's not accessible, but that's not the student's fault, right? We don't place a blame here. It's not because the student needs a screen reader. It's because the old document isn't accessible because it's not able to be read with the current assistive technology that's available. So being attentive to the choices we're making in our design, we're removing accessibility barriers from the get-go. In fact, we're removing them before they exist, before they even materialize, baking them in as we're creating. So I'm going to do a sort of meta thing here and talk about the structure of this presentation and how I considered access in my design choices, which were limited. We didn't do a fancy design here. So first, on that, aesthetically, you might think it's not much to look at, and that's intentional. I have very limited text on each screen that is separated by the same kind of bullets from slide to slide within the deck. The limited text is written with high contrast, just black on white. And the reason it is not wordy is both, to not obscure the purpose of the headings, the points. It's really to guide the presentation, but it's not relying on someone's print literacy alone to access the content of the presentation, which is why I'm speaking over it. And as I'm doing so, I'm using the live captioning feature that's embedded really into, I think, all presentation or all modern presentation software platforms. I'm simply using PowerPoint, and I have it on my default setting so that it just says always use subtitles. So you can find that in the top ribbon, whether you're using a Google slide deck or PowerPoint or something else. That's typically just a flip of a switch in a pretty obvious space on most interfaces. So so that's what I'm using to capture my words. And those captions are not perfect, certainly, but it's better than nothing. I do not have any embedded images that are that's not true. I don't have any embedded images that are purely decorative, because then people who are using a screen reader either have to filter through alt text descriptions of things that don't actually contribute to the content, or if I had used meaningful graphics like charts that present essential data in them, and then I failed to include alt text descriptions that would also be inaccessible to some people. There are a handful of static images, maybe 3 or 4 later in the presentation, and those are ones I chose to include. They're just screenshots to demonstrate some of the resources that are available in Pressbooks, and they needed to just be static images for people who might not have an account to link to the resources. And of course those include alt text. So and a side note about that, most presentation platforms and publishing platforms like Pressbooks will include automatic AI generated alt text, and sometimes it's okay for a really basic image. I did have to edit all of mine here, and typically do, for it to be meaningful for a screen reader to read it out loud to somebody. So, and as another aside, I'm glad I can use accessibility as kind of my reason for an otherwise sort of visually lackluster slide deck, because I'm actually not particularly skilled at visual spatial anything, and I rely on that little design feature in presentation, software to make sure that things aren't just a jumble. So there's my confession of the day. I'll totally use the pre-packaged design templates, but I will absolutely write my own my non-AI generated my own alt text descriptions so that they're meaningful and tied to the content. I guess this is maybe a bit of an abrupt transition here, but I could go on about all the equity and inclusion based sort of underpinnings of open education for a whole day, and we have to connect the dots here. I know that most people who are accessing this presentation have a general idea about OER, because you're at the stage in your interest where you're creating your own content. So I'm not going to do a super deep dive here, but for the sake of, shared definitions, we'll just say that open educational resources are, the way they are designed, at their heart, are designed to increase access for all people, right? In their very creation, beyond the fact that they're free. So yes, they are free to students. They are flexible in how they can be used due to Creative Commons licensing and digital platforms that allow them to be adaptable, so that teachers can revise them, remix them. Students too. I should limit that to teachers. Can revise and remix them and have them sort of be evergreen in a way that old-fashioned textbooks maybe aren't. So I guess this is at a time where I promised a little bit more insight in my intro about how I, got to this interest in accessible course materials from my work in disability services. So I feel like I could share that now. Though the interest was actually a little bit in reverse. So when I was a grad student with a now bygone future plan to be a middle or high school English teacher, I went on a grad student scholarship to what I think 15 years ago was called the, I'm 15 years ago, that's just a random number, but it's 15-ish years ago, called the Academic Technology Institute, which was held at the University of New Hampshire. I wasn't a student there, but that's where it was held. And they were talking about, this fancy revolutionary new thing called open educational resources. And, as people were learning about it, I just kept thinking about, the social justice underpinnings, because that was a big topic in my grad school, in the era of grad school I was in, just the social justice underpinnings of anything. And what these, OER, or they didn't consider themselves maybe OER librarians or content creators then, but what these folks were there trying to do and learn. And there was like a good, that was 15 years ago, like I said, and there was a good few years of, delay to the aha moment. But after doing a little stint in teaching in high school, I mentioned that I found myself working, not teaching high school, middle school, but I mentioned that I found myself working as in a disability services offices at a university, like without having really much previous training in that area, aside what I learned from maybe like learning about how to create an IEP while I was a grad student. While I was working in the disability services office, simultaneously the faculty at our university was going through their first big like OER initiative. This is not the same college where I am now, but there was just a lot of institutional interest in open educational resources, and they were well supported. And as that was happening, I realized how great that more accessible materials would be for the students that we saw in our disability services office. And for the interest of time, I'll fast forward through the ripple of connections that kind of exploded, that led me to a doctorate where my dissertation focused on the classroom experience for students with disabilities in courses that used open educational resources. So that's kind of where that connection happened, and then I've just grown it in all sorts of fun and crazy ways over the course of my career. Moving on. I couldn't decide where to put this slide because, the legal foundations aren't my favorite part to talk about. But as I'm talking through it, I realized maybe it should have been a little bit earlier. But I also wanted it to not be so focal that I'm causing people to worry about the legal aspects of accessibility. That's not really a worry that is for content creators to like shoulder, at least not shoulder themselves. That's kind of on the, collegial support that you might have from your accessibility experts, maybe in instructional design, possibly librarians or other people who have kind of walked the OER road before you. But I also wanted it, so I wanted it to get a little bit less top billing. But it's still an important piece of the why, like the why we must do this accessibility stuff. But it's not really why we choose to or why we ought to, since I think most folks who are interested in OER are already in some way like interested in access and inclusion anyway. So that said, just briefly acknowledging the legal framework. So we have in the U.S. Accessibility is required under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and some parts of Section 508. That's the part that both Section 508 and in Title 2 of the ADA are the ones that really speak to digital accessibility. Again, I don't want to get into like a deep dive into a legal lecture, but I want to acknowledge that accessible educational materials aren't just something we do kind of like an optional extra thing we sprinkle on after we create something, but like something we should bake in, because they're part of equitable access that we have all of these regulations, to protect. And I absolutely just promised you that we would do away with the legalese, but I do need to make explicit the connection to the WCAG or WCAG or WCAG, depending on regionally where you are and who you're talking to. I prefer to just use the letters WCAG, but I want to make it a connection between the WCAG standards and then the regulations I mentioned before, 504 and ADA and 508, as they're born out of those regulations. They used Title 2 of ADA as their guiding principle, or kind of their reason for coming into fruition, if that makes sense. And so the WCAG guidelines, which, if you work anywhere in education or government or, any entity like that, you've undoubtedly heard some chatter about this. They're the sort of global standard for web accessibility. It stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I should have mentioned that. If you're an IT person or a librarian or instructional designer, you maybe have heard even a lot more about this than other people, and maybe you've taken it upon yourself to become an armchair expert, or maybe you have been ducking for cover or plugging your ears every time the WCAGs, I just said I wasn't going to say WCAGs, and here we go, the WCAG standards are mentioned, or anything in between, and it's 100% okay whether you're really invested in these and learning about them, or you're not, or anything in between. And I just want to emphasize that, you don't need to be super involved in these standards in their details. You don't need to memorize them. That would be difficult and lengthy because there's something like 100 benchmarks, and ironically, they're not written in the most accessible format. Like obviously accessible digitally, but in the sense that they're a little jargony, in my opinion. But at the end of the day, like I mentioned earlier, it isn't your sole responsibility as content creators to ensure that the WCAG standards are met, but if you're applying general accessibility principles and you're using like the tools that are built into platforms that are available to you, then you're probably meeting them. And especially then if you're running it by your institutional experts, that like can give you that extra layer of reassurance. And all that said, it's helpful to understand that the core ideas, behind the WCAG standards are, really, I just wanted people to understand that they're connected to the existing disability laws. So there was an understanding of why we do it rather than just kind of following a protocol. Okay, so getting into a little bit more of the specifics behind WCAG. Again, I said we're not going to go into the details of 100 different benchmarks that don't really make sense, or some of them do, but most of them to just a non IT coder sort of person. So these accessibility guidelines, um, the ones that we're concerned with are built around 4 core principles. They call them the POUR principles, fun little acronym. So POUR stands for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So when we talk about something being perceivable, that means that users can perceive the information from various senses. So whether they're perceiving it visually, auditorily, or through the use of assistive technology, they need to be able to perceive it in multiple ways. Operable, similarly, they don't need to just be able to perceive it, but to navigate user interfaces, to be able to interact with the content in all the various ways that people might do that. Understandable, that is just referring to the clarity, really, of the content, making sure that it's clear, consistent, predictable, readable. And robust is more about how the accessibility principles that are baked in kind of extend from one platform to another. So robust more refers to how access works, for example, using a screen reader across different technologies. Let me give you a couple more concrete examples, because we're talking about this sort of abstract thing. So a couple more concrete examples for POUR principles. So for perceivable, if you're using an old scanned PDF, we're back to the old scanned PDF example. It might not be perceivable by someone with low vision, who needs to use a screen reader to access your course materials. For operable, I mentioned before that it refers to navigation in a digital space. So if someone who is accessing the actual hardware that one uses to access a digital space, like a laptop or tablet, differently, they might need to operate your course materials, your website, using a keyboard instead of a mouse, or by using vocal commands instead of just your standard keyboard strokes. So understandable. For example, we talked about it being clear and consistent in structure. A really one of my favorite examples that is very concrete for that is if you're using a Google form or any kind of fillable document. I shouldn't knock a Google form, just any fillable document and online form, there needs to be descriptions or instructions to tell people exactly what's expected to go in that field. And robust, that's a little harder to, I think, expand on beyond the fact that it needs to be used by multiple platforms. But if you had I don't know, an individual image that has a decent text description, but then has an inoperable hyperlink or something that doesn't cross platforms and isn't, or transfers you to something that is not up to standards and can't be accessed by a screen reader, that wouldn't be particularly robust. So again, like I said on the last slide, all of this can feel like a lot if you have limited experience, or if you're new in your experience in thinking about digital accessibility. But the tools that are embedded in, well, again, here most people are using Pressbooks, but whatever platform you might be using, they all kind of connect back to the POUR principles, the perceivable, operable, understandable, robust. So you can kind of take some comfort in the fact that those accessibility tools that are embedded are rooted in something that is connected to the WCAG regulations, that's connected to greater disability law. So it all kind of funnels into each other. Okay, so I don't claim to be a super tech savvy, like on the brink of the next new thing, sort of person. My knowledge and, my keeping up to dateness about WCAG's guidelines is really kind of on the level of what do I need to know to stay current ish in my field, and be able to speak sort of intelligently about what's going on. So we have other people on campus who are absolutely experts in this. So I feel like I have a good layman's understanding of what's changing, and I can, convey that to other people. I know that part of the heightened conversation around these new guidelines is about this latest version, which I think is just, the descriptions of what was changing came out, I think, in 2023, and then deadlines, as of the time that you're likely accessing this presentation, depending on like the organization, the deadline for meeting those initial like updated standards passed, because that was, I mean, recording this in early April, but it was, the end of April was the deadline of 2026. 2027 for some entities, but for our purposes as people who are just creating, I shouldn't say just, it's an amazing pursuit, but for people who are creating OER, we don't need to have this expert level understanding of the differences between the previous versions and the updated guidelines. But in general, the updates focus on the 4 areas in this slide. So mobile access, we have more technology apps that are happening on mobile devices than in the previous generation of guidelines. Cognitive accessibility, so we're thinking about access for people of multiple cognitive profiles. Clear navigation, again, I talked on the slide that went into details about the POUR principles about navigating between different websites, between different areas of content. Clear focus indicators, and it's also important to note that I think one of the reasons that I say it's not important to memorize the specific guidelines, like the big takeaway here is that accessibility is not static, right? Like it's changing constantly. Like things have already changed as far as how people are accessing and engaging with digital content, like since the new guidelines were written, even though they're not fully implemented yet. And once they're fully implemented, there's going to be other new apps and other software, new social media platforms that are going to emerge, and then new accessibility needs are going to pop up that we didn't even anticipate. So these kind of guidelines have to be consistently, revised, revisited, kind of like OER, as we evolve. So again, because most people who are using this content, at least for what it was originally created for, I hope, maybe this will be evergreen and people will use it for years to come for other things. But for this particular purpose, folks were using a Pressbook account, or they have a Pressbook account to build their OER. I am familiar with Pressbooks from my previous work, when I said that I worked at an institution that was doing a lot in terms of OER creation. But even as someone with some familiarity, I still go to my experts when I have content creation questions. So I share that because I want to keep reiterating through this presentation that you're not doing this all by yourself. You're not learning a new platform and responsible for all of the iterations of how to make the most out of that platform, including the most accessible content. That is part of your responsibility and partly your responsibility, but you have so many supports and resources. So like Pressbooks, I think it's a good, strong platform when it comes to accessibility. That doesn't mean that it makes content automatically accessible, because that's why we have a presentation like this, because the users need to be able to kind of know what they're looking at, know what accessibility checkers are looking for and what they might be flagging. But I think Pressbooks does give you a good structure. It gives you useful tools. But how you build the content really does still matter. So in the next several slides, I'm going to focus on what some like accessible practices might look like. And I'll share some screenshots that are specifically like from Pressbooks. But these are, and they're screenshots, just, I think I mentioned this before in case people are not accessing this from the slide deck, but just from a recording. Um, and yeah, like I said, these are tools that are, and the screenshots specifically are from Pressbooks, but they're common tools across like other content building platforms, because they're all fairly standard these days. So before I go into any like individual features and images, I have here just a screen grab of the contents area, the table of contents from the accessibility guide that's embedded in Pressbooks. It's really comprehensive, much more so than we can do here, but you can see just from what is listed about making your content accessible that they have a lot of resources, and a lot of these links actually link out to work done by BC Campus, who's obviously a big contributor to the open education world. So, and I think that later in the presentation, I don't know if it'll link while I'm recording, but I may try to do that just to show you what they're linking to. Yeah, anyway, so let's talk about a couple of specific things you can do. So when we're thinking about just the very basics of accessible content creation, the first thing we start with headings. Start at the beginning. A heading makes sense. So if you can take the like 10 minutes, I don't even know if it'll take that long, a quick YouTube tutorial to just learn how to use the heading structure in whatever interface you're using. In Pressbooks, this just means using the little heading like drop down in the editor tool, rather than just using like a text editor that makes your text bold or big or, changes the font size. If you actually use the embedded heading structure, that creates an outline that a screen reader can navigate, and it also can help readers like scan the page for like useful information. So it's like really helpful for cognitive accessibility too. And if we use them consistently and like try not to skip levels, so headings have different levels based on like, is it a heading, a section heading, a subsection, that kind of thing. Like we do that to emphasize certain material, and so if you're accessing that with a screen reader, like that helps people to have the same benefit of that like visual organization, even if they can't visually perceive it. But again, yeah, it's helpful for cognitive accessibility as well. Do I have a screenshot of the headings? Yeah, so this is just right, yeah. So this is just a same thing as before, but I wanted to show a couple of the other features here. So Accessibility Assist is the name of the actual accessibility checker, I would say, that's embedded in Pressbooks, and you can see when you drop it down that headers are a big concern for them. And you'll see as you run the accessibility checker, like for it to flag issues automatically, that you'll get this red check headings and alt text icon that comes up with the flag that tells you how many it is clickable, so you can go and hopefully repair the issues that they found that were flagged by the accessibility checker. Similarly, we talk about alt text. That's kind of, I feel like, so headings are my kind of first layer of digital accessibility, like 101 talk. Alt text is, the next really important thing. So, again, any, modern content creation platform, anything, even something as simple as this presentation, this slideshow, up to like full books, right? In Pressbooks or anything else, they all kind of now automatically give you a space to include alt text when you embed an image. So when you, and that's great, right? That's great. But alt text, if you don't know what to do with it, then that might not be very meaningful. So the alt text that you type in to describe the image should describe the meaning or purpose, not just how it appears. So for example, instead of writing, this is a chart, you might say like, this is a bar chart that shows increasing enrollment for a particular program over a 5-year period. But like if the image you have is purely decorative and isn't really adding content, it's not adding information, it's probably like, I don't know. Either don't include it, or it's appropriate to leave the alt text empty so it doesn't like bog down the assistive technology, if that makes sense. So it gets skipped. But I would say just take the time to write really good alt text descriptions if you're gonna include images, even if it's decorative. Why not? So links. So this is another really important one. So when we are using links, it's really important that we avoid vague phrases such as click here or read more, because that's not telling us it's not going to tell a screen reader any specific information that it needs. So instead, like if you use descriptive links text, like view the course syllabus or read the library's caption guide, this matters, because a screen reader that uses navigation, like that needs to navigate from link to link, if it's not descriptive, it's not going to be meaningful or helpful. I don't know if it'll let me click on here when I'm presenting. I don't think it will, but I thought it would be funny. I don't know if it's funny, but because Pressbooks links to all of BC Campus's accessibility guidelines, if you're accessing this presentation from the actual slide deck, you'll see that the descriptive link links to the Pressbook OER that BC Campus has about accessibility. It's really great. So again, just in sum, because I'm now rambling a little bit, avoid creating links that just say click here. Make sure that you're using descriptive links. So I gave an example. Do not say read more here. Yes, say something like read BC's accessibility OER. We know exactly what we're navigating to. So if you're going to use tables, I mentioned this during the brief mention of a bar graph when I was talking about, what was I talking about? Alt text, image description. So tables should be used for data, but not like just for their visual layout. So if you use a table in Pressbooks, like make sure that you're using all those other principles from headings, make sure it has a good header row, make sure it has like a simple structure, try not to like have like merged cells in your table, or crowded like visual anything, because that's harder for assistive technology to accurately interpret. And chances are, if you've chosen to include a table, then it is probably to be sharing important data. So make sure it's using it for that data only. You're including headers, you're keeping anything superfluous out of that, so it's just as clear and simple, direct delivery of the content as possible. Okay, so color and contrast. This is a low bar. What I mean low bar, not because it's not important, but I mean like a low investment accessibility check that most people could do without any specialized tools. Don't use light text on a light background. Don't use dark text on a dark background. That's just difficult for people, with low vision, people with aging eyes, people who just need kind of the attentional grab of a higher contrast for just, better comprehension, cognitive accessibility. And we don't want to use color alone to convey meaning. That's actually really important. So, you don't want to say the items in red are important. That could create a barrier for some users. So make sure there's enough contrast between text and the background so that the content is readable. It's just, having that good contrast and the ability for the contrast to be part of like emphasizing certain information is great for everyone. I mean, obviously, like the students I work with, who might have a print literacy accessibility issue, like it's essential for them, but really helpful for all people, I think. And multimedia. I'm going to say finally multimedia. I think this is the last tech slide, but I could be wrong. So when we're using multimedia materials, when you're creating them, make sure that we're using captions for all our video, transcripts for the audio. This is obviously supportive of any students or colleagues we have who are deaf or hard of hearing, but it also helps people who might be accessing materials in noisy environments, or for people who prefer or even need, maybe because of like an auditory processing disorder, to read along with those captions, or just people who need or benefit from reviewing the material in a different way, whether it's visually or auditorily. Wow. So captions and transcripts are both really essential kind of basic accessibility practices, and also good general learning support for everyone. So anything that you're using to create content, whether it's the note app on your phone or something as sophisticated as Pressbooks, is going to have tools for generating captions and transcripts. Like I said, you can see in this recording that I just have the CC feature on all of my PowerPoints, and it's kind of taking care of that captioning. So just kind of, I did say just a little summary of accessibility tools that are embedded in Pressbooks, but also you can find something so similar in any kind of platform you're using. So almost like Pressbooks certainly includes their own accessibility checker. It allows you to use accessible like themes, templates, so things like having proper heading structure is less labor for the creator. So those like accessible themes are part of that support. And same with like how you export them like as different file types for multiple formats for different kinds of access. So these are all really helpful tools. I always say that they're the tools, they're not the human behind the tools, so they're not a substitute for designing intentionally, which is why we take the time to create and listen to presentations like this. You don't have to be an expert, but having a general idea of why we're doing the things we're doing, I think, is really powerful and can kind of drive some of the the work that we're doing. Yeah. So a couple of key takeaways here. Accessibility, I will, my stump speech is that accessible practices are beneficial for everyone, not just for people with disabilities. We do it because it's legally required, but it's also a choice. It's a choice that we're making because we're, ethical people who have a commitment to inclusive pedagogy, and we make these little design choices and little bits of effort that can make a really huge difference in our materials reaching many, many more people. And if we are taking that time to build access in from the beginning rather than trying to retrofit it later, we're going to save ourselves a lot of time and effort and be, really proud of the work we are doing in service of accessibility for all people. So as you continue doing this work, make sure that you're using all of the resources available to you. This is not solo work. Oh my goodness, it's absolutely too much for one person. So make sure that if your campus accessibility professionals are plugged into this work, that you can rely on them, support staff for any kind of open educational resources initiative that you have, your librarians, instructional designers, and like those guidelines themselves, the WCAG guidelines. It's not something that faculty should have to figure out all by themselves. Collaboration is really, a key to feeling successful in our collective efforts to make knowledge more accessible for everyone. So I have for sure taken up enough of your time. I am also support. I am also a resource. Nebi certainly has my contact information, and I've agreed to support people who are working on OER creation in Pressbooks through the current grant. So please don't hesitate at all to reach out to me. It is just lovely to share in this work with you, and I thank you so much for the opportunity.